Good morning and welcome to Life at Noon. This is Rachel H. I'm one of the librarians here at Lone Star Sci-Fair, and I'm actually our presenter today. We are going to be discussing one of my favorite things, which is graphic novels. Up here. So there's a lot of misconceptions about what a graphic novel is and why we may want to pick one up. And the answer is because they're fun, and also because it's a whole different medium of reading and literature. So what even is this? Is it the same as a comic book? Who wrote the first one? These are some of the really common questions about graphic novels. And the first one is, it came around in the late 70s. This guy up here in the right-hand corner, his name is Will Eisner. If you have heard of the Eisner Awards, they give that for the best graphic novel in several categories. So it is actually a whole book award category in and of itself. And there's lots of definitions of graphic novels. There are as many definitions of graphic novels as there are actual graphic novels. Eisner's original definition of it was just very simple. His definition was it's sequential art. Now, Eisner had actually worked on a comic oriented for adults before he published what would become known as the first graphic novel. He actually worked on an adult comic called The Spirit, and it dealt with a lot of the darker issues going on with society and that might happen with superheroes. So graphic novels originally were oriented to be more of an adult sort of read. And I know now we think, oh, these are a kid's thing, right? They're basically comic books. And the answer is not really. Unlike a comic strip where it just ends in that one comic strip, you get the whole plot. The graphic novel is told sequentially, using images and words in a combination to form a whole over a larger amount of space and time. So you're getting a lot of content. You're getting a lot of difficult themes. And it isn't just fun superhero stuff. Graphic novels take a lot of different forms. As to who wrote the first one, we get told a lot that it was Will Eisner in the 70s with his book A Contract with God, but honestly, there are earlier things that could qualify as graphic novels. In the 1800s, there was a British press that was actually printing a cowboy-themed graphic novel for the British public. Even as early as pre-Jane Austen, the publication of Pamela, which was one of the first big selling novels, there were accompanying engravings or etchings or illustrations, what have you, that got put up in the store window that people watched for. So even if it hadn't formally taken the shape of a graphic novel, they have existed for a very, very long time because it's words and pictures to tell a story over an arc. So the first one that is really recognized is Eisner's A Contract with God. And the thing about Will Eisner is he moved from the Spirit comics into writing A Contract with God, which was about living in the 1930s Jewish tenements. And the theme is a man who loses his daughter to cancer breaks a contract that he made with God, and what are the consequences here? And he's actually dealing with his own grief and his own childhood in some ways because that's where he grew up. Is it the same as a comic book? Oh. This is a really contentious one because it depends on who you ask. I personally would say there are some comic books that are graphic novels, and there are some that aren't. That's just a personal opinion. Some people consider it all the same across the board, and some people are very strict about their definition of graphic novels. They think, okay, this has to be defined with a singular plot arc. It can't go over multiple books. It needs to all be in one spot, just like a regular novel would, and have a defined beginning, end, middle, plot wise, and that sort of thing. A lot of comics do have that. It's about perceptions of depth. Eisner was kind of wanting to distance himself from the comic book world because he was actually talking about, you know, his personal life, his personal experience, and using illustrations to express that. So it's a much more serious thing to a certain extent. Depends on who you're reading. So these covered some of the basic questions about graphic novels. Now, comic books paved the way for the graphic novel in some ways. Comic books in the 40s and 50s were subject to what was called the comic authority, which is basically the comic book version of ratings on TV, or, you know, what you can say on the radio and what you can't. It was basically a censorship board. Partially because comics had just become really huge at that time. They were being read 50% boys, 50% girls. A lot of comics up until that point had been very adult oriented. And people had started, you know, around the time of the Second World War to be thinking about, okay, propaganda, Captain America, we want to be able to control, to a certain extent, his image, because he was actually used to sell war bonds and that sort of thing. So keep in mind, the comic authority was around until the 80s, into the 90s. And for a while there, it was really strong. They were one of the dominating forces in comics, and that's why we got a lot of the more gentler plots that people think about when it comes to comics and graphic novels. So as time goes on, people get really annoyed around the 60s and 70s and even parts of the late 50s about, there's somebody telling me what I can and can't write and what I can and can't draw. And authors like Kirby, Stan Lee, Frank Miller, they started to rebel against that and actually built the comic culture that we have now, that you see. And it, you know, it paved the way for Marvel films. It paved the way for graphic novels, because all of a sudden, you know, people like Stan Lee and the X-Men, he was discussing the AIDS crisis that was going on. You had the Black Panther comics that were talking about race and, oh, here in terms of comic books, this is a single edition, or as we like to call them, singles. It means just one edition of the comic, one part of the story. So, you know, you might tell the same story over 12 or 15 or 50 of these comics. And it presents the issue of, okay, you know, I have to go and try and find all these back issues to read it. And so at some point they decided, we're just going to collect these issues, bind them together, and publish them in a book. And that's what you're seeing here on the right. These are called trades. Trades look like a graphic novel. Some of them probably qualify as graphic novels. And they contain multiple issues over a story arc. So that's all nice and neat and in one place. So when Eisner first published A Contract with God, they didn't call it a graphic novel at the time. It was just a trade. So this technically dates to the 70s. And as you can see, the book that we've been talking about, A Contract with God, we have a picture of it right there. We actually do have copies of these in our system. I checked. These are the 4, I'm going to say, graphic novel classics that really kind of changed the graphic novel world. The first one to exist is A Contract with God, but then we get into Art Spiegelman, and he wanted to tell the story of his father's experience as a Jewish person during the Holocaust. And he used the medium of art and representing the Jewish people as mice, the Germans as cats, and the Americans as dogs to tell the story of the Holocaust from his father's perspective. And he actually has become a staple in a lot of middle grade reading lists and that kind of thing. Graphic novels, partially because of him, are making their way into the curriculum. And, you know, this is obviously not a silly comic book. This is a very difficult personal story. And it kind of started that transition of graphic novels being more of a space to tell the stories that people wanted to talk about. So Batman, as we knew him up until this point, had been very much, you know, biff, pow, wham kind of guy. And it followed the old Batman TV show, the old 40s and 50s Batman comics. I've read them. They're adorable. They're silly, but they don't have a whole lot of depth to them. And this is from someone who absolutely loves Batman. One of my big entrances into the Bat world in some ways was Frank Miller's The Dark Knight. So Frank Miller actually got a hold of the Batman line and decided, so if you've seen the film The Dark Knight Returns, all of those, they're actually based on the Dark Knight comics. And it was such a long run that they bound it and published it as a very large trade volume. And it's considered a graphic novel because this is the story of Batman once he becomes very jaded, once he's stopped being the Caped Crusader and he's had to come back as an older, more darker kind of anti-hero story. And Frank Miller opened the door for Alan Moore, who you guys probably know from The Watchmen, if you've seen the film. And The Watchmen is very much an anti-hero story. It's what happens once superheroes get told to retire. But unlike The Incredibles, it talks about government and issues with superpowers and control and what sort of damage this does to you. Because if you think about superheroes, it really is a fight. Okay, so one of the popular trends that's been happening for a while now is graphic novels are becoming movies and TV. And it's not just Marvel and some DC comics that are doing this. It's actually making it into HBO. It's coming from some of the Image lines of comics. It's coming from foreign comics as well. So what we're seeing now is this huge rise in graphic novels because the story and the imagery is so good, being reimagined as movies and television. So we've got Blue is the Warmest Color, which is on Netflix, Preacher, which I know is a completed series, The Road to Perdition, League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. I think Sean Connery was in that version. The Kitchen, which should be coming out again on Netflix, as well as The Old Guard, Snowpiercer, which took a lot of major awards, not only in the comic area, but it was transformed into a film and it took several of the big awards. You guys have probably seen Sin City. and Scott Pilgrim and V for Vendetta. They're all kind of established classics now, though they were really some of the bigger breakthroughs for comics in the film and TV genres, as well as The Walking Dead, which obviously has made some multi-billion-dollar breakthroughs. So these are actually really complex stories that have been adapted for the screen. Now, people often think, okay, graphic novel becomes a movie, becomes TV. Yeah, that makes sense. The thing is, it goes both ways, possibly because merchandising, if you can sell it one way, you can sell it another. But what's happening now is a lot of really famous books are being adapted into these graphic novels, and the original authors are actually working with the artists and selecting the artists to give a visual version of their story. So you get ones like The Lightning Thief, which is a middle grade, The Handmaid's Tale, which came out maybe a couple months before the show, The Parable of the Sower, as well as Kindred, Octavia Butler, Dune, which just came out in the past year or so, and it's really stunning. If you like Jason Reynolds and his sort of YA urban fiction, and I just found this out this past week, they have actually adapted Long Way Down into a graphic novel, and I am so excited about it. And I am looking forward to reading it, and we actually do have it. So all of these we actually do have. The first person to really start adapting a book for graphic novel format was actually, well, one of the first was Neil Gaiman. So if you're familiar with Neil Gaiman, it was his Sandman series, which is a pretty dark artistic series. American Gods has had an adaptation, as well as several others of his. So he was a real trailblazer in that area. There's also TV shows that have become graphic novel continuations. So Doctor Who, because it tends to leave you a little bit on a hook, the BBC has partnered up with a British comic press to publish the Doctor Who comics, and also Avatar: The Last Airbender. That show, when it ended and when Legend of Korra ended, and actually several other Nickelodeon shows, has actually picked up as a comic and continued. Now, the most frequent adaptations that you'll see of a book to a graphic novel are actually classics. So you get the Pride and Prejudice, you get Sense and Sensibility, you get things like manga classics, which there was a very big misconception that because the graphic novel format adapts to include the pictures, that you'd be missing some of the actual text with some of the Shakespeare ones. And the guy who headed up manga classics decided, okay, you know, he was an ESL student, he was learning English, and he was thinking Shakespeare would be so much easier to learn if I had pictures to go with this original text, because first class, you got to read the original text, right? For a lot of classes, it's that way. Well, he decided to pair with artists and create these line of manga classics that are word for word the same as the originals, but paired with images. So a lot of adaptations have started to follow that format. However, you do get things like Matt Fraction's Odyssey, which you can see right here, which is a retelling of the Odyssey, and it is very illustrative, and it's very psychedelia, which kind of makes it fun, and it's still an ongoing series. Prince of Cats won a lot of awards. It is an adaptation of What If Romeo and Juliet happened in Brooklyn and Tybalt was the main character. in a little bit of an alternate universe. And it's great. Okay, so graphic novels, they're classified as nonfiction, but you see a lot of things that the story is very fiction, it's made up, it's fun. Here's the shtick though. It's getting more and more popular to immortalize people and history in the form of a graphic novel because it's more accessible. And also because with the graphics, you have a way of illustrating what was happening at the time that you didn't have in a physical book. And one of the first people to do this, you may have encountered this in a school curriculum as well, or heard about it in the eulogy for Congressman John Lewis, who was big in the civil rights movement, is the March series. So he actually got the idea to write the story of the Civil Rights March and his involvement in it from SNICC at the time during the Civil Rights Movement had been publishing comics and distributing them and saying, okay, you know, people need to know how to vote, what their rights are, how to deal with the justice system, you know, where do you get legal representation, that kind of thing. And comic books made it easier because you had this visualization, you had it, you know, kind of boiled down to here's what you need to know. And those were distributed throughout the civil rights movement. Well, John Lewis, once he became a congressman and he'd served some years in Congress, he decided he wanted to write the story of his part in the civil rights movement. And he actually partnered up with a gentleman who was one of his aides, and they wrote together the book March. And now there's 3 volumes of it. And actually, before Congressman Lewis passed, they published the sequel to the March books, which is called Run, which is about what actually happens to John Lewis after the march is over. You know, once that glorious civil rights story is over, what happens afterwards? And that's actually what Run covers, is his congressional run and trying to get elected to Congress. Persepolis was another big breakthrough. It's the story of a young woman growing up in Iran under the Shah and what happens when her family, who were somewhat involved in the revolution, what happens when it succeeds, and a more different type of government takes over, and they had to flee as refugees. And she uses the comic format to tell her story. Alison Bechdel was one of the first lesbian women to really have a great deal of success in the comic scene, talking about LGBTQ issues, and her book Fun Home, which is now a musical. Yeah, it's now an awesome staged musical, so see that if you have the chance, is about her dad and him passing as straight, but being gay, and how that affected her own journey towards figuring out her sexuality and what her home life was like. Harlem Hellfighters is one of my favorites. It is beautiful, and it is the story of a World War I unit of African-American soldiers who were actually fighting under the command of the French. You've probably heard a lot of hype about this one. It is They Called Us Enemy, which is George Takei, star of some of the Star Trek series. It's his story of growing up in a Japanese internment camp. This is one that I had come across through a webinar and had just fallen in love with. This is La Voz de Mayo Tatarambo, and it's the story of Ramon Juarigue, his service in the Second World War, and then coming back and having to fight the Tucson City Council to get a better life for the Pascua Yaqui tribe, which is a group of Native Americans, and they are now a recognized tribe, but they actually had to go through a really difficult process to get that recognition. And Mayo stands for Mexican American Yaqui and others. So he was actually getting a lot of different local groups together, and his great grandson is the one who wrote the script for this, and they crowd pooled the money for it, I think through a Kickstarter, for a really long time, and it finally got picked up by the major press publisher. It was The War of the Trenches is a World War I French. It's translated from the French graphic novel. The Silence of Our Friends is talking about a 1967 civil rights case in which 5 young men at TSU were falsely accused of murdering a policeman when it was actually a friendly fire accident, and the advocacy in their community that went on during that time period to get their freedom. 21 is the story of Clemente and his breakthroughs in baseball. And I beg your pardon, Photographic, The Life of Graciela Iturbide is actually a 2018 Moonbeam Children's Book Gold Award winner, talking about the life of the Mexican photographer Graciela Iturbide and her journey through photographing the United States, Mexico, India, and other parts of the world. So graphic novels can actually cover a lot of ground. You get to know people and their actual stories and what happened in history in a way that is different from regular history books. You're getting to see these people's faces, and to see, like in Harlem Hellfighters, it shows you what the battlefields looked like. So it might help with imagining things if you have a harder time with that. And Hark a Vagrant I put in here because it's one of my favorites and it's tremendously fun. And Kate Beaton is, if you remember the old show Hysteria, that was describing some historical things, and it was very fun. Kate Beaton actually gives you a really good laugh in Hark a Vagrant. She takes a really satirical eye on history. So I love graphic novels. This is pretty obvious by now. And if I did have infinite space and funds, my personal library of graphic novels would be the size of the actual library. But I have neither of those things, so I'm pretty selective about what graphic novels I have. Here's a few authors that I really love. They talk about mental health, they talk about diversity, they talk about romance, they talk about just being funny or light or silly. Sarah Anderson, you might have seen some of her stuff. She goes by Sarah Scribbles. And she talks a lot about her life in New York and her life as an artist. Katana comics are obviously a really romantic, silly comic that describes, I think, what romance actually looks like on a day-to-day basis. That can be arranged to the family. She talks about her arranged marriage and how that kind of happened. I Left the House Today is just hilarious, as are Hyperbole and a Half and Solutions and Other Problems. Yes, I'm Hot and This is another Huda family, but she's talking about daily life as a hijabi in the United States and some of the really silly things that she gets asked and has to answer. She also has a book called Who the F Am I, which is coming out for young adults in the fall. And of course, you guys have probably seen Strange Planet, where Nathan W. Pyle takes normal life and translates it into aliens. These are some other ones that I love that didn't really fit a specific category. Lovelace and Babbage, this is the history of Ada Lovelace and Babbage, who were building a calculating machine, but the idea here is that it actually works and that they can time travel. American-Born Chinese is a combination of Chinese folktale fables and the story of Asian American young people trying to figure out their place in the world and their community. Monster Friends is a juvenile graphic novel, but it is tremendously fun and it is adorably cute. Barely Functional Adults by Mei-Chi Ning made me laugh out loud. If you liked Hyperbole and a Half, you will absolutely love Mei-Chi Ning, because she talks about mental health and moving new cities and trying to deal with, being an adult with everything else around her. You guys have probably heard of The Oatmeal. He's a very satirical comic. He's pretty well known. He does do a lot of political stuff, but I love his book, How to Tell If Your Cat is Plotting to Kill You, because I sometimes wonder if, according to him, my cats are plotting to kill me. Amulet is another juvenile novel, and it's, we find a mysterious item and get portaled to another world and have to go on an epic quest. Unwritten is basically what would happen if the author of Harry Potter had written magic into the story and given that magic to their kid, and what their kid would do as sort of a washed up adult if they got plunked into this magical fantasy world where they were the savior of everything and had to fix everything. The Wicked and the Divine is the idea of what would happen if gods actually existed in our world. Saga is a romantic space opera saga. Descender talks about the war between machines and man through the eyes of a child robot. Raven is a retelling of the Teen Titans story, specifically about Raven, and the sequel to that one is Beast Boy. And that one actually recently came out in the past couple of years. I'm really excited about that. Rejected Princesses is an old favorite, and it's probably not technically a graphic novel, but what this author does is he got fed up with the Disney princesses that his daughter was being presented with and wanted to show her what actual princesses and royalty and really strong women had done in history. And he does a lot of research and illustrates it like these characters are Disney princesses with their real life stories. I'm going to be real with you guys. This is not heavily my category, but I wanted to include some horror in here because it's become really popular in terms of shows right now. So the Sabrina TV show that you've seen on Netflix is based on the New Adventures of Sabrina. Lock and Key, if that one's familiar, is also brought to the screen by Netflix. Through the Woods is retellings of fairy tales. American Vampires, what happens if a vampire hates his makers, hunts them down, and is not allergic to sunlight? It's actually pretty interesting, and it's fairly fun. It's just very gory, which is why it makes this category. Something is Killing the Children is the idea of, what happens if something is killing the children, but the only people who can see is the kids. And this author actually got a really big NPR interview for My Favorite Thing is Monsters, because her art style is almost pointillist or sketch art, and it's gorgeous. And it's the story of a mystery in the 1930s into the 1940s. So this category is a bit of a silly one, but graphic novels, one of the big draws with them is the art style and the story. And all of these have really beautiful art styles and stories that draw you in. These are kind of my top picks, if you will, for graphic novels that are just gorgeous. So The Sleeper and the Spindle is Neil Gaiman's take on what happens if Snow White rescues Sleeping Beauty. And it is done in an illustrative style, so it's super intricate. The gilding that you see on the covers throughout it, it is beautiful. Pretty Deadly is kind of a rare one in that it's a Western comic, but it's not necessarily a cowboy heavy comic. It's not, you know, cowboys and guns and that kind of thing. It actually does a really good take on twisting the Western and making it into something more modern. And the art style is a little bit more sparse, but this is basically if, you know, if Death's daughter roamed the earth, what would she do? Monstrous is about a war between humans and monsters and kind of what is going on there. It is a horror comic. I'm going to be blunt about that, but it is deeply beautiful and intricate. And it's one of those stories that you end up remembering and it sticks with you and you end up kind of feeling it later on. Sculptor is a single volume, which is one of the things that I love about it. And Scott McCloud has this really nice fluid art style. It's a bit different than a lot of other stories. It moves very fast. And it's the story of a sculptor who trades part of his life for his art and what happens there. The Arrival is a really old one, actually, and this one is kind of ironic because it has no words, none at all. The Arrival is solely done in images, and it's the story of what would happen if this man crossed over basically in Ellis Island in the early 1900s, and he comes to a country where he doesn't speak any of the language. So even if there is writing, he can't read it, he doesn't recognize it. So the entire story is told in these gorgeous, really intricate pictures where he puts details and clues about what's going on in the context of the illustration. And the Tea Dragon Society is a juvenile graphic novel, but the reason why it's in with the gorgeous graphic novels is because she does all of this artwork herself, and it's beautiful, and the story is just very charming. So I couldn't resist giving it as an add-in. So there are ones that I'm really, really excited about in the incoming, and keep in mind, I read tons of web comics, which is actually where almost all of my personal shelf came from. It's just web comics that I fell in love with on Instagram or Facebook or other social media platforms. And there are some that I'm really excited about. Tea Dragon Tapestry, which has just come out. So that one's a follow-up to Tea Dragon Society Run. We talked about this one, Congressman Lewis's book. Brandon Sanderson, the well-known fantasy author, has just come out with one of his graphic novel partnerships about the Dark One, which is the idea of if a person was going to get into a fantasy world and be basically its version of Voldemort, do they have the right to hunt you down in your actual existence before you become the Dark One, and how he undergoes this journey and is trying to stay alive. Wake is a new one we have it on order right now. It hasn't formally come out yet, but it's talking about women who led slave revolts, and it looks like it's a really good, deep history, which I'm already a fan. Sleeping Beauties is another horror comic, but Stephen King and his son Owen King worked together to write the scripting for this, so it's gotten a lot of hype, and we actually have copies of that one. This one is one that I am hoping that we will acquire eventually, which is Lore Olympus. It's one of the most popular webtoons, which is a website or an app that lets you read content from new and up and coming creators, and you can actually choose what you want to read and choose what genres and that kind of thing. And it's probably the most popular webcomic right now. It has not even released a graphic novel yet, and it already has merchandise at places like Hot Topic and Box Lunch. And it's a retelling of Hades and Persephone and how they fall in love. And it's two parallel worlds, which is our world, which is stuck in the Greco-Roman era, and the world of the deities, which is basically the world that we live in now. And the interaction between them, between the gods and man, and between each other, and retellings of classic Greek myths in a way that's done with a lot of heart and humor, and is just really gorgeously done. And this is just everything that I looked at for this, if you wanted to look it up later for yourselves. I actually am really passionate about them. I encountered them through trade comic books first, and then I ended up falling in love with the slice of life kind of comics and graphic novels where it's actually telling a story that has really happened. And speaking of slices of life, next week I am super excited to have on Life. I'm joining Danielle Pace, and we're going to do a presentation together about the background and history of the mocktail, and she's going to be coming via video to teach us how to make some fun and delicious mocktails, because I know we all want to beat this heat, and what better way than a good mocktail. All right, guys, thank you so much for coming, and I will see you next week.